Everything ends. Here's why the Buddha called that good news. Hook. Everything you've been told about impermanence is half the teaching. The Western version goes like this: nothing lasts, people leave, your body breaks down, and the best you can do is make peace with it. Accept it. Let go gracefully. The Buddha taught something else entirely. He taught that impermanence is not the obstacle to your freedom. It is the only reason freedom is possible. That's not a consolation. That's not a reframe to make you feel better. That is the actual structure of his teaching. From the second discourse he ever gave, all the way to the last. And if no one has explained it to you this way before, this is the video where that changes. Act 1. The bad news. Let's start with what you already know. You know that nothing lasts. You don't need a Buddhist teaching to tell you that. You've lived it. You've watched your parents age. You've buried people you loved. You've looked in the mirror and seen a face that doesn't quite match the one you remember. You've held something precious, a relationship, a career, a version of yourself, and felt it slip. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, the way sand moves through fingers, no matter how tightly you hold. This isn't philosophy. This is Tuesday. And somewhere along the way, you learned the lesson that everyone seems to agree on. Everything is temporary, so enjoy it while it lasts. Appreciate the sunset because it fades. Love harder because people leave. Live fully because time is short. It sounds wise, it sounds mature, and it is, as far as it goes. But here's what's strange. You've known this for years, maybe decades. You've agreed with it. And yet, has that knowledge actually changed anything? Has everything is impermanent ever made the loss lighter when it came? For most of us, honestly, no. Because knowing impermanence and seeing impermanence are two completely different things. And the distance between them is where the entire Buddhist teaching lives. 2,500 years ago, in the city of Savath, the Buddha sat with his monks and asked them a question, SN 15.3. It was a strange question, the kind that sounds simple until it lands. What do you think, monks, which is greater, the water in the 4 great oceans, or the tears you have shed while wandering this long, long time, crying and weeping from being joined with what is displeasing, being separated from what is pleasing? Pause on that for a moment. He's not asking about cosmology. He's not asking about doctrine. He's asking, how much have you cried? The monks answered, as we understand it, Lord, the tears we have shed are greater. And the Buddha confirmed it. He didn't soften it. He listed what they'd wept for: the death of a mother, the death of a father, a brother, a sister, a son, a daughter, the loss of relatives, the loss of wealth, the loss of health, again and again across lifetimes beyond counting. More tears than water in every ocean on earth. Now, if you're over 50, if you've lived long enough to have lost someone who mattered, someone whose absence still has weight, you don't need to believe in past lives to feel the truth in that image. The ocean of tears is not a metaphor you have to accept. It's a measurement you recognize. The Buddha knew you had cried. He didn't minimize it. He didn't say, let it go. He didn't say, be grateful for what you had. He measured it. And then he said something that changes the entire direction of the teaching. The closing line of that sutta, the very last words, this is enough to become disenchanted with all fabricated things. Enough to become dispassionate. Enough to be released. Read that again. He didn't say, "This is enough to be sad." He didn't say, "This is enough to accept." He said, "This is enough to be released." The grief is real. The losses are real. The tears are real. But in the Buddha's framework, they are not the conclusion. They are the evidence. Evidence heavy enough, accumulated enough, measured enough to tip the mind in a direction most people have never been told exists. And this is where the teaching you've heard, and the teaching the Buddha actually gave, split apart. The version you know ends here. Everything is impermanent. It's sad. Accept it. The Buddha didn't end here. He didn't even pause here. He said something you may have never been told. Something that reframes not just impermanence, but the entire reason he taught it in the first place. Act 2. The reframe. Try a thought experiment. Imagine, just for a moment, that everything was permanent. Not in the way people wish for. Not, "I wish this beautiful evening would last forever." Imagine it literally. Imagine that nothing could change. Nothing could end. Nothing could become something other than what it already is. Sounds like paradise for about 3 seconds. Because think about what that actually means. Start with suffering. You've had dark periods in your life. Maybe a season of grief after someone died. Maybe months of anxiety that sat on your chest like a stone. Maybe a stretch where you woke up every morning and the first feeling, before your eyes were even open, was dread. A heaviness that colored everything. Now imagine that feeling and make it permanent. Permanent means it does not lift, not tomorrow, not next year, not ever. No therapy could touch it, because therapy works by changing something, and nothing changes. No medication could shift it, because medication works by altering brain chemistry, and chemistry doesn't alter. No time could soften it, because time doesn't do anything. The grief you felt at the funeral, identical in intensity on day 1 and day 10,000. The anxiety at 3 a.m., every 3 a.m. forever, at exactly the same voltage. That's what permanent suffering looks like. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just the same, always the same. A prison with no walls, because walls imply an outside. Now go further. If you were permanent, you could never grow. Think about who you were at 25, the things you believed, the way you treated people, the blind spots you didn't know you had, because that's what blind spots are. The version of you that said the wrong thing at the wrong time and didn't understand why it hurt someone until years later. If you were permanent, that person would be the final draft. No revision, no maturity, no slow accumulation of wisdom that only comes from decades of getting it wrong, feeling the consequences, and learning, gradually, painfully, to get it less wrong. Every lesson you've ever learned about patience, about kindness, about how to sit with someone else's pain without trying to fix it, none of that could have happened. Because learning requires that the person after the lesson is different from the person before. And different requires change. And change requires impermanence. Now take it one step further, and this is the one that hits hardest. If every mental state were permanent, then practice would be meaningless. Not just Buddhist practice, any practice, every spiritual tradition on earth, every form of therapy, every 12-step program, every moment someone has decided, I'm going to be different starting today, all of it depends on one assumption, that what you are now is not what you must always be, that the mind can shift, that habits can break, that patterns can dissolve and reform into something less destructive. Without impermanence, none of that is possible. Without impermanence, the alcoholic can never recover. The grieving parent can never find their way back to something that resembles life. The person consumed by anger can never see past it. Not because they don't want to, because the mechanism for change, the very possibility of change, doesn't exist. And here's where it turns. The very thing that looks like the problem. Everything ends, nothing holds, you can't keep what you love, is the only reason a solution is possible. Not a consolation, not look on the bright side. The actual structural reason that change, healing, liberation, growth, any of it, can happen at all. As Thanissaro Bhikkhu puts it, if we couldn't change, there'd be no purpose in practicing. It's because we have this ability to change ourselves, change our actions, change our intentions. That's why we practice. The logic is airtight. If suffering is permanent, there is no path out. If the self is permanent, there is no transformation. If mental states are permanent, every practice in every tradition is a lie. But suffering is not permanent. You are not fixed. Mental states do change. And that is not the bad news. That is the only good news there has ever been. Impermanence is not the obstacle. It is the condition. The Buddha didn't arrive at this through argument. He arrived at it through observation. There's a scene in the suttas that I want you to see, not summarize, but actually see. SN 22.95. The Buddha is standing on the bank of the Ganges River. It's a real place, a real moment. Monks are with him, and he looks down at the water and sees a glob of foam, churned up by the current, floating past, already dissolving. He turns to the monks and says, "Suppose a man with good eyesight were to examine that glob of foam, to inspect it, to appropriately examine it. It would appear to him empty. It would appear to him void. It would appear to him without substance. In what way could there be substance in a glob of foam?" Then he does something remarkable. He doesn't stop at one image. He gives them 5. Form, the body, everything you can touch, is like that glob of foam on the river, appearing, holding shape for a moment, dissolving. Feeling, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, is like a water bubble in autumn rain. Surfaces, pops, surfaces, pops. You've watched rain hit a puddle. That's the lifespan of a feeling, not years, seconds, perception. The way you recognize, label, categorize the world is like a mirage. In the hot season, you see water shimmering on the road ahead. You walk toward it. There's nothing there. It was never there. That's how perception works. It constructs what you think you see, convincingly, reliably, out of nothing solid. Fabrications, the intentions, the plans, the mental constructions that drive everything you do are like a banana tree. You peel one layer, another layer underneath. Peel that one, another. Keep going, searching for the heartwood, the solid core, and you never find it. There is no heartwood in a banana tree. And consciousness, the knowing itself, the awareness that seems most like you, is like a magic trick performed at a crossroads. Convincing, skillful. But when you look closely, there's nothing behind the trick. The magician's hands are empty. 5 aggregates, 5 images, every one of them empty, void, without substance. Now, if this were where the sutta ended, you'd be right to feel deflated. Everything is empty. Great. Thanks, Buddha. But this is exactly where people stop reading, and exactly where the teaching begins. Because immediately after the 5 similes, in the same sutta, same scene, same breath, the Buddha gives the closing verse. And the last lines say this: "A monk, persistence aroused, should view the aggregates by day and by night, mindful, alert, should discard all fetters, should make himself his own refuge, should live as if his head were on fire, in hopes of the state with no falling away. The state with no falling away. Everything before that line was about things that fall away. Foam dissolves, bubbles pop, mirages vanish. Banana trees have no core, magic tricks are empty, and then the sutta points somewhere else entirely, towards something that does not fall away. This is not a modern interpretation. This is not a Western Buddhist adding a positive spin. This is the structure of the original text. In the same discourse, where the Buddha says everything you cling to is foam on a river, he ends by pointing towards something that doesn't dissolve. And he says, that is why you should see clearly, not to despair, to aim. The chain that connects impermanence to freedom doesn't appear once in the suttas. It appears dozens of times, and its most concentrated form, its origin, is in the second discourse the Buddha ever gave, SN 22.59, 5 monks, Deer Park, days after awakening. The Buddha had already taught the Four Noble Truths. Now he teaches them to see. He takes each aggregate, form, feeling, perception, fabrications, consciousness, and asks the same questions. Is this constant or inconstant? And what is inconstant? Is that satisfying or stressful? And what is stressful and subject to change? Is it fitting to regard that as, this is mine, this is myself, this is what I am? The monks answer, no. Each time, no. And then the chain unfolds. The exact sequence. Seeing thus, the instructed disciple grows disenchanted with form, disenchanted with feeling, disenchanted with perception, disenchanted with fabrications, disenchanted with consciousness. Disenchanted, he becomes dispassionate. Through dispassion, he is released. With release, there is the knowledge, released. Inconstancy leads to disenchantment, leads to dispassion, leads to release, leads to knowledge of release. That's it. That is the mechanism, not a metaphor, not an aspiration. The actual sequence the Buddha taught, from seeing impermanence to being free. And in this sutta, the 5 monks followed it to completion. Their minds were released on the spot. Now, you might have encountered this sutta before through a different angle. It's sometimes taught as the discourse on not self. Same words, same monks, different emphasis. That's how Buddhist texts work. The door opens differently, depending on which handle you turn. Today, the handle is impermanence, and it leads to the same room, but there's something deeper still. And this is the part that most people never hear. The Buddha didn't just say impermanence leads to freedom. He said impermanence leads to the deathless, AN 7.46. The perception of inconstancy, when developed and pursued, is of great fruit, of great benefit. It gains a footing in the deathless. It has the deathless as its final end. Gains a footing in the deathless. Not helps you accept mortality. Not makes peace with change. The deathless, something that does not die. And there's more. Another sutta lists 6 rewards of establishing the perception of inconstancy in the mind. AN 6.102. The last reward, the culmination, is this. All fabrications will appear as unstable. My mind will not delight in any world. My mind will rise above every world. My heart will be inclined to unbinding. My fetters will go to their abandoning. Heart inclined to unbinding. Not heart resigned to loss. Not heart that has learned to cope. Heart inclined toward unbinding. There is a direction in that word, a leaning, a magnetic pull, away from what dissolves toward what does not. And Nibbana itself, the final goal of the entire teaching, has 44 names in the suttas, SN 43, 44 epithets, and at least 5 of them only make sense when placed against impermanence. The unfabricated, no arising, no passing away. You can only hear that word against the background of things that do arise and pass away. The deathless, meaningful only because everything else dies. Permanence, the direct antithesis of inconstancy. The ageless, the undecaying. Each one a word that borrows its meaning from impermanence. The way a candle flame borrows its visibility from the dark room around it. And there's a passage in the Udana that makes this architecture explicit. Ud 8.3. There is, monks, an unborn, unbecome, unmade, unfabricated. If there were not that unborn, unbecome, unmade, unfabricated, there would not be the case that escape from the born, become, made, fabricated would be discerned. But precisely because there is an unborn, unbecome, unmade, unfabricated, escape from the born, become, made, fabricated is discerned. Darkness makes light visible. Impermanence makes the unfabricated visible, not as an idea, as a destination. Now, before we go further, there's something I need to say, because if I don't, I'd be doing exactly what the Buddha warned against. Everything you've just heard is true. Impermanence does lead to freedom. The chain is in the suttas. The direction is toward the deathless. But, and this matters, seeing impermanence is not enough. Thanissaro Bhikkhu makes this point sharply. This is why being constantly mindful of the truth of impermanence isn't enough to solve the problem of suffering. Seeing impermanence is necessary. It is the door. But walking through the door requires more than seeing it. It requires the entire framework, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, the training in virtue, concentration, and discernment. The modern error, and it's everywhere, is to treat everything is impermanent as a philosophical conclusion, a bumper sticker, something to nod at wisely during a sunset. The Buddha never taught it that way. He taught it as a tool, a perception to be developed and aimed at disenchantment, aimed at dispassion, aimed at release, within a framework, with training, with practice. Thanissaro translates anicca not as impermanent, but as inconstant, the negative of nika, which means dependable, reliable. The point isn't that things end. The point is that they cannot be depended on for lasting satisfaction. That's a sharper blade. And like any sharp blade, it requires skill to use. Otherwise, you just cut yourself. So, impermanence is the door. Yes. But the Buddha didn't give you a philosophy. He gave you a tool. And the tool only works if you know what you're building. What that building looks like, what it feels like, is what the suttas describe next. And it's not what you might expect. Act 3, the practice. There's a word in Pali that has no clean English translation, and it sits right at the center of everything we've been talking about. The word is nibbida. It's usually translated as disenchantment, sometimes revulsion, sometimes weariness. And every one of those translations gets it slightly wrong, in a way that matters. Because when most people hear disenchantment, they think of something dark, something that sounds like giving up, losing interest in life, a gray flatness where joy used to be. That is not what nibbida means, not even close. Ajahn Chah, one of the great forest masters of the last century, put it this way: disenchantment isn't disgust, If you feel disgust, that's wrong. So, what is it? Thanissaro Bhikkhu uses an image that I think lands better than any definition. He says, imagine you've been eating the same food for a very long time. Not bad food, decent food. But one day, you realize you're simply not hungry for it anymore. Not because the food got worse, not because something ruined it. You just don't need it. The appetite has quieted on its own. That's nibbida, not rejection, not bitterness. The appetite quiets. And then he gives another image, one that's wider. He says, imagine you've lived in a small village your whole life. You know every house, every dispute, every piece of gossip. You're deeply invested in all of it. Who said what to whom? Who was right? Who was wronged? It feels like the whole world. Then one day, you leave the village. You walk to the edge of the Grand Canyon, and you stand there, and the sheer vastness of it, the silence, the scale, makes you realize how small and petty all the affairs of the village were. Not because they were evil, not because the people were bad, but because there is something so much larger, so much more, that the village simply cannot hold your attention the way it once did. That's disenchantment, not depression, not nihilism, not life is meaningless. It's more like a maturing, a growing up, the way a child eventually stops believing in Santa Claus, not with anger, not with grief, but with a quiet recognition that the world is bigger than the story they were told. And Thanissaro says what comes after, what waits on the other side of dispassion and disenchantment when they're done properly, is total release, total freedom. The luster fades, not because life got worse, but because you finally started seeing it as it is. And what you see, past the fading, is something the village could never show you. Now, I want to do something different for the next few minutes. I'm not going to explain. I'm going to show you what the Buddha showed his monks, and I'd like you to receive it the way they did, not as information, as observation. There was a teacher long before the Buddha. His name was Araka, AN 7.70. He lived in an age when human beings lived 60,000 years. 60,000. Long enough to almost forget that they would die. And even then, in that impossibly long life, Araka taught his students about impermanence. He taught it with urgency. He said, the life of human beings is limited, trifling, of much stress and many despairs. The Buddha remembered Araka with respect, and his point was simple. If even Araka, in an age where death was almost unimaginable, taught this with urgency, then how much more should we hear it? We, who have so much less time. Araka taught with images. The Buddha preserved 4 of them, and I want to give them to you slowly, one at a time, the way they were meant to be received. The first, tomorrow morning, early before the sun rises, if you step outside, you may see a dewdrop sitting on a blade of grass, small, perfect, catching whatever light there is. Araka said, human life is like that dewdrop. When the sun comes up, it's gone, not destroyed, not violently ended, simply gone. Because that is what dewdrops do. And there's something in that image that's easy to miss. The dewdrop doesn't know it's temporary. It doesn't grieve its own disappearance. It simply sits on the grass, holds the light for as long as it holds the light, and then it's morning. The grass is dry. The world moves on. What Araka is asking is not, isn't that sad? He's asking, can you see it? Can you see the beauty and the brevity as the same thing? Not 2 things, but one. This is what the Buddha taught. Not to make you sad, but to make you see the second, A mountain river, the kind that runs through a steep valley over rocks white with speed. Araka said, "That river does not stop. Not a moment, an instant, a second where it stands still. It is always going, always carrying, always moving past. You've stood near a river like that. You've felt it. The sound alone tells you something about time. Not time as a clock measures it. Time as the body feels it. Relentless. Indifferent to whether you're paying attention. The water that passed while you read this sentence is already gone. New water has taken its place. You didn't notice the switch. You never do. Your life is doing the same thing, right now. While you're listening to this, it is not paused. It will not pause. Not for grief, not for joy, not for understanding. The river doesn't care whether you've noticed it. It runs. The third. This one is harder, and I want to give it to you honestly, because you deserve honesty more than comfort. Araka said, "Think of a cow being led to slaughter. With every step, every single step of its foot, it is closer to its slaughtering, closer to its death. There is no step that leads away. There is no detour. There is no step that is neutral. Every step, including the ones that feel like standing still, including the ones that feel like progress, including the ones that feel like celebration, goes in one direction. If you're over 50, you don't need this explained. You feel it in the way your knees respond to stairs, in the way a name slips just beyond reach more often than it used to, in the way the years between birthdays seem to compress, not because time speeds up, but because the proportion changes. A year at 60 is 1/60th of your life. A year at 10 was 1/10. The steps are the same length, but you can see the building at the end of the road now, and you couldn't before. Araka didn't say this to frighten. He said it to wake. Because the cow that knows where it's going walks differently from the cow that doesn't. Not with panic, not with despair, with a kind of seriousness, a refusal to waste steps, a clarity about what matters and what doesn't, that only comes when the road has a visible end. The fourth, imagine drawing a line in water, with your finger a line across the surface of a still pond. Watch what happens. The line disappears as you draw it, not after, not a moment later, as. There is no moment where the line exists complete. By the time your finger reaches the end, the beginning is already gone. Creation and dissolution, simultaneous, not sequential, not first it appears, then it fades. It is fading as it appears. That, said Araka, is a human life. Not just in the large sense, birth to death. In the small sense too. This sentence is a line drawn in water. By the time you hear the last word, the first word is gone. This breath, this thought, this moment of understanding, it is dissolving as it forms. And the natural response to that, the one Araka intended, is not grief. It is attention. Pay attention. Because the line is being drawn right now, and it will not be drawn again. Sit with those for a moment. Don't analyze them. Don't turn them into lessons. Don't reach for, what does this mean for my life? Let them be what they are, images offered by a teacher who lived 60,000 years, passed down by a teacher who saw further than anyone, and arriving now at your ears in a life considerably shorter than both. There's one more teaching I want to leave you with, and it comes from a sutta whose title Thanissaro Bhikkhu translates as an auspicious day, MN 131. The Buddha gave a verse, and it begins like this: You shouldn't chase after the past or place expectations on the future. What is past is left behind. The future is as yet unreached. Whatever quality is present, you clearly see right there, right there, right there, right there, not somewhere else, not in a memory, not in a plan, in the thing that is happening now, the only thing that has ever actually happened. And then the verse takes a turn that might surprise you. Not taken in, unshaken. That's how you develop the heart. For, who knows, tomorrow, death. Who knows, tomorrow, death. Not as threat, not as morbid warning, as fact, the same fact Araka taught, the same fact the dewdrop teaches every morning. And that fact is not the enemy of the present moment. It is the present moment. It is the reason this moment is real. Think about it. A dewdrop that lasted forever would not be a dewdrop. A sunset that never ended would not be beautiful. It would be wallpaper. This moment, this breath, this word entering your ear is real precisely because it will not come again. Impermanence does not steal the present. Impermanence is the present. And the Suta's closing line, whoever lives ardently, relentlessly, both day and night, has truly had an auspicious day. So says the peaceful sage. An auspicious day, not an auspicious life, though that may follow. A day, one day, lived with the kind of clarity that only impermanence can sharpen. There's a final piece, and it may be the most important. Because after everything we've discussed, the thought experiment, the chain, the similes, the epithets, the direction toward the deathless, you might be wondering, how do I get there? What do I do? What act of will is required? And the answer the Buddha gives is, perhaps the most surprising thing in this entire video, AN 11.2. For a person who knows and sees things as they have come to be, there is no need for an act of will. May I feel disenchantment. It is in the nature of things that a person who knows and sees things as they have come to be feels disenchantment. No need for an act of will. You don't have to force disenchantment. You don't have to manufacture it. You don't have to talk yourself into letting go. When you see clearly, when you truly, directly see that form is foam, that feeling is a bubble, that perception is a mirage, that fabrications have no heartwood, that consciousness is a magic trick, the disenchantment arises on its own. And from disenchantment, dispassion. And from dispassion, release. Each stage unfolding from the one before, naturally, the way a fruit ripens. Not because you pulled at it, because the conditions were right. The Sutta describes the entire chain this way. Virtue gives rise to joy. Joy gives rise to concentration. Concentration gives rise to knowledge and vision. Knowledge gives rise to disenchantment. Each one spontaneously arising when the previous one is in place, like dominoes, like seasons, like a flower that opens, not because someone forced the petals apart, but because the sun came up. Your job is not to force the petals. Your job is to see clearly. The rest unfolds. We started with a half teaching. The half the world knows. Everything ends. Nothing lasts. Make peace with it. Here's the half you haven't heard. Because everything ends, suffering can end. Because everything changes, you can change. Because nothing you cling to is permanent. The direction towards something beyond clinging becomes visible. The Buddha stood on the bank of the Ganges, watched foam dissolve on the water, and told his monks to live as if their heads were on fire, in hopes of the state with no falling away. SN 22.95. Not in hopes of better foam, not in hopes of foam that lasts longer, in hopes of something that does not dissolve at all. Impermanence is not the tragedy, it is the door that swings open.